Cool. So I think we'll probably go ahead and get started here. And then if people will trickle in a little bit. Just to begin, I'll run people through a little outline of what we're going to cover today. So we'll do a brief introduction of both Ritika and I. We'll do a little bit of an overview of the Cedar Commissions. Really, this webinar is geared towards people who've already dug into the application, so I won't be going into what the Cedar Commissions is in depth, but I'll give a brief overview of it, and then we'll get into some common questions about the Cedar Commissions, and then we'll have an open Q&A from everybody here. So, my name is Robert. I'm the marketing and booking manager at the Cedar Cultural Center, and I'm also the project lead for the Cedar Commissions. I've been at the Cedar for about 2 years now, and this is one of the programs that I work on now. Ritika, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Ritika Ganguly. I'm a 2016-17 Cedar Commissions artist, and I compose mostly in Bengali folk. I also have a background in anthropology, and I found that the two kind of inform each other. Music and anthropology run parallel in my life. And I do nonprofit consulting, grant management consulting for a day job.
Great. Thanks, Ritika. It's a lot in there. Just moving on to a little bit about the Cedar Commission. So the mission of the Cedar Cultural Center is to promote the intercultural appreciation and understanding through the presentation of global music and dance. Some of the things that we're committed to are artistic excellence and integrity, diversity of programming, community outreach, and support for emerging artists. And I think one thing that's cool about the Cedar Commissions is that it kind of hits all of these areas, especially that support for emerging artists. Just briefly, this program commissions 6 early career or emerging Minnesotan composers and musicians to create and perform 30+ minutes of new music for the Cedar stage. And that, if all goes well, will debut in February. But if social distancing measures are still in place, we'll adapt to those at that time. Cedar Commissions artists earn a $4,000 commission plus $500 production stipend. Artists receive artistic mentorship, administrative and marketing support, as well as high quality professional photos and video. And it is made possible and has been made possible for the last 10 years by a grant from the Jerome Foundation. If you are interested in more information about the Cedar Commissions, I would encourage you to check out our previous webinar, which is on our webpage. That one goes a lot more in depth to each of these components. Who's eligible for the Cedar Commission? Applicants from all different musical genres and styles are eligible. The Cedar is committed to supporting a diverse cohort of artists that reflects its stewardship of global music, relationships, and community. Indigenous people and people of color are encouraged to apply. You must be an early career and emerging artist to be eligible. Jerome gives a good definition of that on their website, and so I would encourage you to check out that. It's linked on the Cedar Commissions page on the Cedar website. Number 3, you have to apply as a lead artist, not as a group, to be eligible. Applicants must live in the state of Minnesota to be eligible. And then full-time degree-seeking students are not eligible for the Cedar Commissions, and previous Cedar Commissions recipients are ineligible to earn that award for 2 years following the commission year, but after that, they can apply. So that is just like a very quick overview of what the Cedar Commissions is and who is eligible for the Cedar Commissions, but we'll get into a little bit more of what the Cedar Commissions has felt like as an artist and some of the nitty-gritty of that process with Ritika. And so we'll move into that section in just a smidge. Winners are going to be publicly announced on August 1st, 2020. Applications are due no later than June 15th at 11:59 p.m. And all applicants will be notified as to whether or not they've received a commission no later than July 15th. All right, I think that moves us into the next section. And this is a section where Ritika and I will cover some answers to some common questions. Yeah. So Ritika, to start off with, the first question that I have is, what do you remember about being a Cedar Commissions artist?
first of all, I mean, I have to say that, in 2016, right about the time that we were preparing to write the application for the Cedar Commissions, Philando Castile was murdered. And it just, I mean, today talking about this really does feel like, so much of history repeated. And in some senses, nothing has changed from 2016. Yeah. So, I think that the Cedar Commissions was just a cool process. I think as a musician, for the very first time, I could start to see the that deep connection between product and process. To be involved in the creative process for that length of time, and then to sort of sculpt the product around those 6 months, that was really helpful. And in hindsight, I think that was the biggest learning for me. But also, I think it was only over the years that I started to fully witness the power and scope of the commissions. It didn't feel like it at the time. It felt like a bunch of 6 compositions, 6 pieces that I was going to compose and then present to audience. But I think subsequently over the years, the more I apply to other funding for emerging career artists, the more it occurs to me that really it was the Cedar Commissions that sowed the seeds for that entire artistry, that whole, not just the creative process, but really to see yourself as a certain kind of artist. So I think that that was the biggest for me. And that's what I remember, that, articulating what I wanted to do, what I wanted to work on, articulating for myself, not so much for a funder, not so much for the Cedar Cultural Center, but really sitting down with what and why I need to work on something. And unless those questions were asked of me, I didn't think I actually ever articulated in my own head, what is it that I wanted to create, and also up until the Cedar Commissions, I was a vocalist, and I recognized myself as a vocalist. But I think with the Cedar Commissions, I, started to look at myself as a composer. And it was really for the very first time that I composed 6 original pieces. So really, yeah, in that sense, it meant a lot.
Great. Thanks, Ritika.
Yeah.
In terms of, you talked a little bit about the process and how that was important for you as an artist. Could you tell us a little bit about what that timeline looked like for you? How much time did you spend composing? How much time did you spend rehearsing?
Yeah. So, my particular project sort of required me to really dive into classical literature, written and oral. My interest was to sort of marry literature and song. And so I wanted to take pieces of stuff that was written by other people, by other poets, whether in oral tradition, in folk storytelling, or like romantic period poetry, so I basically wanted to take those pieces and put them to music and turn them into song. And so what that required of me was a whole lot of time being spent reading, just really reading a lot of literature and identifying poems that would speak to me. But also I was working with a genre of Bengali oral literature that wasn't freely available on the internet. It was also geographically distanced from me. And so sourcing that work, sourcing those poems and talking to the right people and, figuring out who in India or Bangladesh could help me really get my hands on those poems. That took a lot of time, and that was sort of the prep work for me. But as the poems started trickling into my universe, I started, composing, and we all know ideas and creativity don't flow in the same way every day. You know, they come in waves. So not every day was as productive as the other. But I made sure that I sat with the material for at least a couple hours, and that, you know, it didn't lose me and I didn't lose it. And so, yeah, and the other actually big challenge for me, and I think this was peculiar to my project also, was that I picked collaborators who lived in India, lived and performed in India. So a Mexican who played the flute, and she lives in New Delhi, and a guitarist lived in New Delhi. So my process was sort of, you know, every single day finding ways to be in touch with them, to shrink the physical distance, you know, between Minneapolis and New Delhi, and basically to you know, discuss. Is my internet connection unstable? It says no. Okay, good.
It's doing all right.
Okay, great. So yeah, so, you know, that was sort of the specificity of my project, and I think I spent a lot of time, and I used you know, very unconventional modes to exchange music, like Evernote. Can you believe that? I actually,
wow.
You know, at the time, I think Evernote worked best for me. But also, all of us read music in different ways. We don't follow the same you know, Western classical notation. I grew up, you know, I trained in a different kind of notation of music, so that was also another that posed a different kind of challenge for me. I wasn't writing the notation that the collaborators would immediately understand, and so there was a, you know, lot of communication that had to happen around a lot of different things from a, you know, various different angles. So I would say that for me, reading the literature and then communicating with collaborators across distance, expressing that music across distance, took up the most amount of time. But yeah, like I said, I mean, I would sit with the composition itself for about 2 to 3 hours a day. And then, of course, the last couple weeks look very different. You know, the countdown to the performance itself, that looks very different, because then you're in marketing mode. You just, you know, switch on the promo mode. And so marketing and promotion kind of took up a lot of time towards the end of it, you know, right at the tail end of the 6 months.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I think you've touched on a lot of the different questions that we have here. Are there any other parts of the Cedar Commissions that you found specifically beneficial at that moment in your artist career? I know you talked about how valuable it was to be asking yourself, like, what kind of artist you want to be. Were there other aspects that you felt like come to mind as something that you found valuable at that point in your career?
Yeah, you know, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of the platform that the Cedar Commissions really is. The marketing was just so huge. I'd never really thought around that, you know, sort of packaging or branding myself in any way. But I think this 6-month process, and of course the marketing team, you know, led by Alana at the time, was incredibly helpful and efficient in sort of getting my cohort and I to think about what is it, how is it that you want to come across to the world? You know, what kinds of new audiences or existing audiences do you want to engage? Why does that matter? So looking back, I think I would have liked to take more advantage of that process, and I didn't do enough. In the sense that, yeah, I mean, you know, from like writing blogs to headshots to you know, Facebook pages, that all of these platforms can be used simultaneously, and that's such a great supportive environment for an artist who's wanting to launch oneself, and especially at that emerging stage, that I think that, you know, we tend to forget, we tend to prioritize the composition over the aesthetic imagery, or, you know, the image of the artist and the branding of the artist. So I think that that is something that's super important, and that really helped me at that stage.
Cool.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, identifying the advertising initiatives and really sort of optimizing this whole digital print marketing platforms, that was something that was amazing. Yeah.
Another kind of nitty-gritty question, Ritika. A lot of people end up having questions about budget.
Yeah.
And so I can also go into just examples of ways that people have used their budgets. But in particular, if you would like to share, would you like to share the way that you broke down your budget? Doesn't necessarily need to be like specific numbers. You can say percentages or who you paid, what kind of stuff you used it for.
Right. You know, I actually ended up using the major part, the disproportionately, I would say, like a really large part of the project budget to bringing my collaborators into town. So there were 2 international tickets to be paid. So I, you know, and for me, that was very important to have them on the stage with me, sort of, you know, performing, but also through the whole process. And so that was a huge part of the budget. And then I also spent some funds in hiring a nanny for my then newborn, which allowed me to be, you know, to spend that time away from my baby, and really work on the compositions. And yeah, I think that was mostly it. Yeah.
We do have a question coming in.
Sure.
Is now a good time?
Is it directly related to budgets?
No.
Okay. I think we'll pause just a second. And then I think we're on the cusp of launching into the free Q&A part. So let me just double check our list of questions here. I can talk a little bit about what people have used their budgets for in the past. A lot of people will designate a large portion of the funds to pay themselves and to be able to take time off of work, you know, setting aside 8 hours a week, something like that, and then paying themselves a certain rate per week based on the 6-month period. People will use that money to pay their collaborators, pay them for rehearsal time, pay them for performance fees. People will use a portion of it for, like Faisa used a portion of her production stipend for an instrument mic for her karar, which is a special instrument mic for an Ethiopian instrument. And so that was something that she used her budget for as well. There have been other artists similar to Ritika who used their Cedar Commissions budget to pay for transportation, specifically like Ubers from their collaborators who lived in the suburbs who didn't have a car. And so they used their budgets for that as well. I think one last question, Ritika. One question that we always like to ask Cedar Commissions artists is, have you, I guess, taken this work forward with you into the future? What has become of it now that you have finished the Cedar Commissions period?
Oh my God. Yeah, it really did bloom into so many different things. So the year after the Cedar Commissions, I was very inspired to take the same the logic of the material, not the same material, but that whole logic of like using oral and written literature to comment about socio-political realities around me. I took that into the Naked Stages program. So I applied for that. And I kind of, for the very first time, I was kind of stepping outside of the musician boundary a little bit and stepping into the performance art realm. And it really became something else. The ideas that I had for the Cedar Commissions project, I took and I kind of made that into a physical theater piece. And then the next year, I got the MRAC Next Step fund for field research. So I wanted to really, visit, like do field trips and visit these areas where this particular Bengali musical style is a living tradition. And so I wanted to meet the musicians. I wanted to really, sort of understand the kind of innovations that are happening within this, traditional Bengali folk style. And so really you use that for like various different components of the same process. So it feels like that was the first step to many more. In that sense, I think the Cedar Commissions for me was more of like a career launch than like original work launch. It was a new musical work, but then it also led to so many different things and just opened up so many different pathways that yeah. And I also do want to say that, at the time, so 2016 is when I came back to the US. And I had been a student here for a really long time, and I was here till, 2012. And then I left the country. But coming back in 2016 and getting into this, familial network of the Cedar Cultural Center, that meant the world to me at the time. Because just that whole process of having a cohort to work with who are all coming from different backgrounds and different genres, really communicating with them. And then the staff at the Cedar Cultural Center, I always think, there's such a kinship with, that can be established. So there's just so many ways in which it's supportive. It's not just supportive in terms of like, music, like institutional support for music, but it's really a very supportive environment for all kinds of like feeling like a whole person. So I think that was pretty invaluable to me at the time, and I carry that to today. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your thoughts, Ritika.
Sure.
I think with that, we're going to open it up to audience Q&A. And so if you have questions, you can either type those questions into the chat, or if you'd like to ask that question verbally, just raise your hand within Zoom using that function, and then we'll call on people to speak. And Emmy, our booking director, she's going to be the one who's moderating this question and answer section.
I'll note that the previous question that I referenced was answered in the most recent description you gave, Ritika, so that question has been answered.
Okay.
Oh, great.
Another question has come in from Fela. I asked my two collaborators to work with me for the amount I budgeted in my proposal, $1,000 each. I gave them a general idea of the rehearsal timeline, but it was a flat rate kind of proposal. Do I need to itemize that in more detail, or is it okay to just pay that fee to work with me on my project?
Yeah, I would say that it's up to you the way that you would divide it, but that to me would read as enough of a designation and itemization. I wouldn't expect an applicant to necessarily break it down hour by hour.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good question.
And from Julie, this question is for Ritika. Was there something that really happened during the process that you had to change?
Great question. Yes, all the time. I think I was working with a lot of variables, with 2 international collaborators, wasn't sure about the visa process. So, you know, all of the travel itself got a little bit delayed. And all I got with them under the same roof in the same physical space was 2 weeks. And so there was a lot of adapting that had to happen constantly. That was one. The second was that, you know, there were some poems that I had in mind to compose, and I couldn't I couldn't find, you know, get access to them, and so I had to sort of shift my priorities a little bit there. But also, I think, you know, music-wise, I mean, there's always an idea that we have in mind when we set out to compose something. We have a soundscape, we have an overall sound in mind. But I think it was really demanding to not, how do I say this? You know, to sort of let that process feel free, you know, to develop on its own. So I think that the more I tried to control the process, the more it felt like I would not be able to accomplish it. But the more open I was to it, you know, openness to instrumentation even. You know, I had a certain arrangement in mind for certain songs, and that didn't work out. And so, yeah, there was a lot of that. So availability of resources, availability of time. The 6 months is actually, you go back to that point that I was trying to make a little bit ago, is that the 6 months can feel like an adequate timeline. It could also feel too long, depending on what you're doing in those 6 months. You know, sometimes it felt a bit tight for me. Sometimes, you know, that 6 months felt like I didn't have enough time. And sometimes it felt like it was just right to retain the freshness of the project, you know. So so I think that, you know, that constant need to feel motivated for those 6 months, and to be open to the product changing, you know, to the sound itself changing, and to the presentation style changing, you know, that was a learning for me. Yeah. Did that answer your question? I'm sorry, I can't remember who asked that question, but.
I'm going to pause the slideshow since we're in the open question and answer section now.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions that are coming up for people?
Ritika, Julie did say that yes, great words, and thank you for the wisdom.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Julie.
Thanks everybody for hanging tight in the silence. I know that these times can sometimes feel awkward on Zoom.
Another question from Fela has come in. Related to Julie's question, there's flexibility from the Cedar if your proposal evolves as you get underway. So let me say that again. So there's flexibility from the Cedar if your proposal evolves as you get underway. And then you think you're going to write 15 short songs, but you end up writing 6 long ones. You think that you'll start rehearsing in November, but you end up starting a month earlier or later than that, as examples.
And so is the question whether that's supported, whether that's encouraged?
Yeah,
whether
I think
that's allowed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that flexibility is definitely allowed. I can just think back anecdotally to some pieces that happened last year. There's one artist who's like, I'm going to compose half an hour of music about my grandfather's journey from Europe to Mexico, immigrating from Europe to Mexico. And he actually ended up composing like 50 minutes worth of music. There are other people who thought that they might write 5 or 6 songs who ended up stripping it down to just 4. And so there's that flexibility for things to evolve as to what feels right. Yeah. And I'm trying to think about what that, yeah, and then in terms of the second aspect of that question, in terms of like, let's say you get started earlier, you get started later than what you designate in like your timeline, that's totally fine. Yeah, there's that flexibility.
Yeah. Thanks. And from Julie, when you get stuck during composition, what did you do to relieve the roadblock?
Let me think. I don't know. I mean, I think that I did a lot of discussing with my cohort. I remember the whole process as being one where you used to meet with each other a lot, and these were outside of the Cedar organized meetings, and I think that sort of talking about where you're stuck, what or even like connections that other artists have in the city. So if you want to talk to people about how to really move forward, there's just so many ideas pouring in from the cohort itself that I found that very helpful. But also I think that compositionally speaking, I think everyone has a different process of how to sort of overcome that roadblock, and I just did it by moving away from it, like creating some distance from that particular composition. If I got stuck in it, I would revisit it in maybe a few weeks or something like that. And originally I started out wanting to make 8 pieces, but that didn't happen, and I don't exactly remember why. Maybe I just wasn't satisfied with the quality of the composition, and 6 made more sense for the 30-minute piece. I think somewhere down the line you get into production mode, like it starts out with a prep and a composition mode, and then somewhere around December, January, if the presentation is in Feb, you get into production mode. You start imagining yourself in the space, in the main stage theater. You start hypothesizing around an audience, and so I think that doing that really helped me to sort of imagining myself in that space, and really sort of understanding what can be a tangible 30-minute output for those 30 minutes. So I think yeah, by December, January, when you start talking to local radio stations about your work, is when you become a different kind of artist. I will also mention, it may not be directly related to the question asked, but communicating with tech was a huge part of the process for me. I don't think I had direct, one-on-one communication with the lighting team, with the sound team in quite the way that I did for the Cedar Commissions itself. It really sort of, the fact that tech is such an important part of that whole production. If you want like a, multimedia presentation, if you want visuals, you got to start thinking about that really early on. And again, imagining yourself in the space of that main stage really helps with how and what you want to communicate with tech, and that's a really, for most artists, that's a nerve-wracking part, because you're like, oh, I don't want to think about tech, and we find it tedious, we find it whatever, a necessary thing, like evil. But it actually, I mean, in hindsight, it was just so great to work with the tech at Cedar, and just understanding the language that you might use to make your, the way that you're dreaming up your production. How do you communicate that to the tech team? Yeah, I think that's also something that I wasn't ready for. I mean, I didn't know until I actually met with the tech team that this is, such an important part of the composition process, because you get so sucked into composing, that you're thinking musically, but you're not exactly thinking of yourself as being on stage that much. So yeah.
And there is one of the cohort meetings, I guess 2 of the cohort meetings this last year. One of them was dedicated to meeting with Chris, our lead sound tech, and going through the Cedar space, showing what types of things are capable on the Cedar stage, and then showing a little bit of the lighting. And then we also had a separate session where people were talking specifically with the sound tech Raymond for the night. And that was where people were like, okay, like, how many channels am I going to need to use up? Like, all right, who's going to be playing drums? Like, can we have the same drummer? How many instrument mics am I going to need? That kind of stuff. There are a few dedicated meetings for that.
Mm-hmm.
I have another question in. Fela is the correct pronunciation. Thank you, Fela. Related to tech, I budgeted my own sound engineer into my proposal. I think I remember from the last webinar that this is okay, right? My engineer can work collaboratively with the team at the Cedar, right?
Yes, yep. There was one of the Cedar Commissions artists brought in their own sound engineer last year, and they worked collaboratively with the Cedar sound engineer. Yeah, that's totally okay. That being said, if you don't have a sound engineer, the Cedar sound engineer will do that for you. No additional charge. Give just maybe a little bit more for questions. Emmy, are there any questions that are coming in?
This is a follow-up to the last question. Sure. And that can come out of the $500 tech budget, right? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. That's all that's come in so far. This just in from Kelsey. Can you talk a little bit more about the cohort meetings? Are there specific topics or agendas for each?
That's a good question. Ritika, I guess I can kind of lay out what it looked like last year.
Yeah.
So for Cedar Commissions last year, the first cohort meeting was all of the artists spending time together and just kind of getting to know each other as people and as artists, and sharing what each of their projects was about. That meeting was a lot of logistics, just in terms of like setting up the schedule for the rest of the year, going over what the content for those meetings was going to be. But there was also that relationship building aspect. The following meetings, there was one of the meetings that was specifically dedicated as a space for the current Cedar Commissions artists to talk with former Cedar Commissions artists. And that was for, you know, kind of a chance similar to this one, where it's like you're talking with a former Cedar Commissions artist, asking them the questions that you would want to ask them having been through the program. And so part of that was like program directed, just in terms of like what they got out of the program, but then also part of it was artistic feedback and people having questions about ideas that they had. And so that was part of that meeting as well. Another one of the meetings was dedicated to tech walkthrough of the space, and Chris, our lead sound tech, going over kind of what the Cedar's sound system is capable of. It's capable of a lot. It's a big analog board, and we have a lot of different instrument mics available. And then also going through the lighting. And some artists at that point had questions about like, oh, can we use different colors? You know, am I allowed to bring my own lighting designer? And that is something like, yes, you can bring your own lighting designer, especially if you have more complicated scene changes or more complicated cues. So that tech meeting was one of the meetings. Another one of the cohort meetings was it was like an artist show and tell, just in terms of picking one aspect or two aspects, two portions of their pieces, and either sharing out an audio recording of that or performing a bit of it on stage, and then getting feedback from the other cohort artists, as well as guest artist Damien Strange was the artist that gave feedback to the Cedar Commissions artists as well. And that one was maybe halfway or 2/3 of the way through. So artists had had a good chunk of time to dig into those projects. Another one of the tech meetings that I touched on before was specifically focused on each individual artist's tech needs for a given night. And so meeting with the two other artists that share that same night and saying, okay, how many inputs does each artist need? Can we keep the same inputs for the same drummers? Talking through all of those like nitty-gritty tech details. And then there was another meeting that I just can't think of right now. Having a tough time. There was one wrap-up cohort meeting that we had, and that was actually after everything shut down and we started social distancing from each other. So that one was a virtual wrap-up, just talking about how the program went, feedback that they have for future Cedar Commissions and future Cedar Commissions artists. Yeah, there's something else that I want to say about this, but it's not coming to me right now. If it comes back later, I will share. One of the things that I guess I would say about the cohort meetings is that the Cedar Commissions artists expressed this last year that they really appreciated the cohort meetings, and I guess the collaboration and camaraderie that they felt with the other artists. And one of the things that they had was that they actually wanted more intentional like cohort bonding time and cohort spending time. So that's something that we're looking at for this next year as well. Ritika, do you have other stuff to add in terms of, oh, I remembered what yeah. There's a specific meeting where we do headshots and also talk about marketing plans. Yes. And talk about marketing in general. And then Alana at that meeting also did individual interviews with the artists to put up as they're each of their own blog posts. And so that's, as Ritika was saying, talking about which audiences you already have, you know, which audiences you're already in contact with, which audiences you want to reach, and the ways that you want to do that. So, Ritika, is there other stuff? Yeah.
I was just going to ask, is there a video spotlight this time around, or is it mostly like audio interviewing the artists?
We haven't, I guess we haven't decided. In past years, there has been a video audio interview with the artists. And that was one of the things where it's like Alana, the program lead at the time, and then the videographer would go into the Cedar Commissions Artist space and record a little bit of a rehearsal, do an interview with the Cedar Commissions Artist, and then that would come out with each artist installment a few weeks out from the performance. That wasn't something that we did this last year. This last year we did print interviews with each of the Cedar Commissions artists. So yeah, we haven't made decisions about that for this upcoming year yet.
Yeah, just wanted to add also that at each of these cohort meetings, we could have, like, you know, these pre-decided themes like Robert was talking about, but there's also that chunk of time that's open-ended, and the problems that we are encountering in the creative process get discussed, you know, in that window. So we, you know, you would have typically about 15 to 20 minutes to just talk about stuff, to just vent, or something that you were excited about, you know, you could just talk about it. So it was so open-ended, and constantly checking in about the process, that none of these cohort meetings actually felt bound by a theme, you know. Oh, so today is for this is the express purpose of today's meeting, and we have to, you know, sort of talk about this. So yeah, and that also sort of reflects just the flexibility of the whole process itself. So there's plenty of opportunities over the 6 months to sort of grow with the cohort, you know. Yeah, that's what I really loved about the cohort meetings. Just wanted to add that.
Yeah, great. Emmy, do we have other questions coming in? We've got about 10 minutes left.
That's all that's come in so far. I'm just admitting someone who's joining now, so that might bring a question.
One of the questions that I'd meant to ask you, Ritika, that would hopefully be fruitful for the people here. What advice would you give to people who are applying for the Cedar Commissions? You know, having come through the program, having applied for the program, what advice would you give to the people who are, you know, at that first step of applying for it?
Yeah. You know, there's two ways of answering this question. One, as an applicant, like, you know, as a person who's like a potential candidate, and the other is to think about it as a panel, like a reviewer, and I've been you know, on both ends. So I sort of feel like, you know, as an applicant as well as a Cedar Commissions panel reviewer, I feel like that, you know, that delicate balance between project feasibility and project ambition, that's just so hard to strike, right? That's where we need our application to be. You know, when we're thinking about the project, really thinking about feasibility, there's not a whole lot that can be, I mean, you know, we may want to do a lot, but it is 6 months. It is a whole lot of other things that you have to think about, not just the composition. And so being able to convey that at the application stage is so important. And a lot of the times, the most talented composers and the most talented musicians will have these amazingly wild and brilliant ideas, but translating that into the written language or a language to speak, on the video to sort of really write an application, that sometimes is hard to accomplish. So I would really advise that another pair of eyes on the application is just really important. Just having someone else read your ideas, because we are so immersed in our worlds and in our own projects and our own musical ambitions, that how it comes across as an idea to someone who's reading it, there may be a lot of, these two may be universes apart. So like just having another, pair of eyes look at it, getting the application ready by a certain time and having enough time to actually work on feedback, on other people's feedback, is super important. And I think that's something that we don't quite account for in terms of time. So like 15 June, we would probably have an internal deadline set for the 14th of June to finish writing the application. But I really think that using other people as a sounding board and how the idea is coming across is really important, because the panel that reviews the application really comes from a lot of different musical styles and genres, and people may not be conversant in each of the genre that the applicant is representing. And so being able to talk about one's project in a way that makes sense, but also makes people sit up and really listen and take notice is I think just keeping that time for working on feedback is what I would say.
Okay, thanks, Ritika.
Thank you.
All right, Emmy, do we have any other, we've got about 5 minutes left. Any other questions from the audience before we wrap things up?
Nothing so far.
Perfect. I think we'll wait like maybe 30 more seconds. And then see if anything comes up in that time. If not, we can call it a wrap. Got used to these long silences as a teacher.
Silences, I think, mediated through technology is like something else.
It's just like a whole nother beast.
Silence for the cat, it's a whole other, it's a whole other beast.
Thank you from Fela, and thank you, Ritika, for sharing with us from Julie.
Thank you for your questions. Thanks for being here, and good luck. This is so exciting.
Awesome. Thank you, Ritika. Echoing what people have said. Thank you, all the participants for today. Good luck. If you have questions after this, feel free to reach out to me. My email is rlehmann@thecedar, rlehmann@thecedar.org. I'll quick send that out just as something to everybody here. Thecedar.org. So you can reach me there. You can also find me on the website, and also my contact information is on the Cedar Commissions webpage. But yeah, just thank you so much, everybody, for sharing your time together today. Best of luck in the Cedar Commissions application process, and hope you are staying well. Hope that you're staying healthy. Take care of each other.
Thanks, Robert.
Thank you, Ritika. All right. Ciao. Bye, everybody.
Bye.